All right. How's this? Everybody hear me? Okay. We are going to kind of slow motion get started here because it's right up on 3. A couple of quick notices first. Professor Pfeiffer-Herbert is going to be joining us for dinner tonight in the mess deck, and so dinner will be at 5 after the talk. Everybody is invited. If you're not on the meal plan, the department will pick up your dinner, right? So please, please, please come if you are interested in coming to dinner. Second announcement, 4 o'clock here, so right after we're done, there is a panel on the El Faro. This is the 10-year anniversary of that disaster, and so we need to sort of be out of here fairly promptly on time, just so that panel participants are able to come in. So we'll watch the clock, but recognize that we're going to want to finish on time today. Okay? So next up, first of all, welcome everyone. I think, is this our first seminar of the semester? Welcome to seminar, everybody. Want to just give a little introduction for our speaker today. So Dr. Anna Pfeiffer-Herbert is an associate professor and chair of the Marine Sciences program at Stockton University in New Jersey. She holds a Master of Science in Ocean Science from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a PhD in Oceanography from the University of Rhode Island. She was also a postdoc researcher at Oregon State University prior to taking the position that she has now. Dr. Pfeiffer-Herbert's research focuses on circulation of estuaries and coastal areas, with applications to larval and sediment transport dynamics as well as biogeochemical flux. She also works on projects translating large oceanographic data to undergraduate curricula. Her talk today will explore circulation dynamics in shallow bar-built estuaries along the coast of New Jersey, as well as discussing the impacts of flow patterns on estuary ecosystem health and other implications for coastal management. We are super excited that she is here with us this week. So I am going to pass the mic, and then at the end, we'll try to leave a little bit of time for questions in the event that there's any audience questions. Okay? Do you want me to turn this on?
You can turn that one on. All right, so is my mic on? This, you can hear? All right, great. All right, so I am delighted to be here. It's nice to see a few of the faces that were in the oceanography class this morning in here. Good to see you again. And it's really fun for me to come up to Maine where there are rocks, because where I live in New Jersey, there is only sand, like the picture that's in the background here. So I thought it would be fun to talk a little bit about the estuaries that are in sandy depositional environments, which are a lot different from the rocky, deeper estuaries that you have here in Maine. All right, so what I'm going to go through today, I'm going to give a little bit of background on estuaries that maybe is familiar to a lot of you from your classes, but just as a reminder. So I'll go through that pretty quickly. Talk about some of the research questions that I study and my research that I do with my students, a little bit of background on how we go about measuring currents specifically, and then especially because I know we're kind of tight on time today, I'm going to go through some quick sample results and some ongoing exciting work I'm doing to save some time to talk to you about my career path. So I'm going to talk about what I do now, and then I'll talk to you about like how I got to that point. All right, so let's talk about estuaries. So estuaries are these amazing places on our coastal regions where we have mixing of water that's draining off of our lands with salty seawater. And the reason I got drawn into studying these is it's a place where we have a lot of transition and change happening. So there's super exciting transformations that happen in estuaries. The other thing that's amazing about estuaries is they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and geometries. So I just have some lovely pictures on this slide. And so that means that when we study the physics or chemistry or biology that's happening in estuaries, the processes can be really different in different styles of estuaries. So one of the things that we do when we study estuarine physics or estuarine biogeochemistry is try to put estuaries in boxes so we can make some sense of the phenomena that are happening in these very different kinds of water bodies. And so one thing you may have learned in some of your classes is that we split them up by their history of formation. So how did that estuary become created through geologic processes? And so you have up in Maine probably a lot of fjords and coastal plain estuaries. You maybe have some bar-built estuaries somewhere in the state, I'm not sure. Down where I live in the mid-Atlantic, we have mostly these bar-built estuaries that are formed through sand moving up and down the coast that form islands and spits, and those block some of the water or trap some water and collect some river water and collect some seawater. And so they create these very shallow, long systems, and I'll talk a little bit more about what makes them unique. So as a physical oceanographer, I don't care. I do find geology very interesting, but I care a lot more about like what's happening within the water. And so the classifications that I generally work with are dividing up estuaries by the pattern and structure of the salinity patterns that we see as we move kind of up and down from the more freshwater ends to the more ocean ends of our estuaries. And so we talk about estuaries being either vertically mixed, where if you take a CTD, how many of you have used a CTD in this room? Yay! So if you take a CTD and you profile top to bottom, in a well-mixed estuary, you would just see a straight profile, not much change with depth. And in a stratified estuary, when you send your CTD down, you'll go through layers of fresher and saltier water, and the bigger the change, the more stratified that estuary is. All right, so we will often put estuaries in boxes by the balance of that stratification or how much freshwater input there is compared to how much energy there is to destroy stratification through mixing, generally through how big the tides are relative to the size of the estuary. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, but I looked up, I tried to put the Penobscot River estuary on this box. So your local areas would fall up in the top of this chart where you have a reasonable amount of mixing, and you have often quite a lot of freshwater input. Chesapeake Bay, that's near me, kind of falls in the middle of this, and then the research I'm going to talk about in the New Jersey coastal lagoons is way down here where we have not very much freshwater input, just little tiny bits of freshwater coming in. But we have quite a bit of mixing because the water is so shallow compared to the size of our tides. All right, so so we've talked about salinity. Another thing that we look at as a physical oceanographer is how water circulates or how currents form and move water and material throughout the estuaries. So in our stratified estuaries, we tend to see these vertically layered systems where fresher water flows out near the surface of the estuary in a plume that will come out into the coastal area, and then saltier water makes it in at the bottom. So in our vertically mixed estuaries, we don't have layers vertically, and what we often see instead is that the inflow and outflow of water, that circulation pathway, will be side to side or lateral instead of vertical. So I'll show you some data later, and remember this picture and check and see if our estuaries in New Jersey have this side to side or up and down pattern. All right, so we've got tides and river flow and changes in salinity and some movement. And then there are some different factors that cause that circulation to either go faster or slower. One of the most important ones is wind. So when wind blows over the ocean, we can have a local effect where the surface of the water, the surface layer, will flow along with the wind. Maybe, we were talking about Coriolis this morning, so maybe it will turn if you have enough width in order for Coriolis to matter. But it will generally travel in the direction of the wind near the surface, and as you get deeper, the water will go in the opposite direction to balance out that sloping sea surface. We can also have all sorts of interesting things that happen as a result of wind making the sea level change in the ocean compared to the estuary, which will then drive currents faster in and out or slow them down. So we call that a remote effect of the wind. And then another important factor that I've been studying a lot recently is that as water moves in and out twice daily or once daily with our tides, that water is moving over usually some topographic change or bathymetry that's not necessarily flat and smooth. And so what I have up here is a map that some of my students collected on our research vessel, and we'll look at this area a little bit more detail in a second, but the rainbow color scale in here are the water depths in an area at the entrance of an estuary, an inlet, so the ocean's on this side. And just by looking at the colors, hopefully you can see that there are deep holes, and then it'll suddenly get shallow, and there's ridges, and there's all sorts of features that the water has to pass over. So when water passes over irregular bathymetry, that can create motion that wouldn't happen if the topography was really smooth. So we call that some nonlinear interactions between tides and bathymetry that create flows. And since I'm going to talk about it later, I'm just going to define this thing called Stokes drift or Stokes transport. That is the reason why the bathymetry makes the currents change. So have any of you studied waves and talked about Stokes drift at all? A few of you maybe in a physical oceanography class? Okay, so the general idea of this is that when we have something moving in a wave pattern, generally how we teach you is that the water will go in a circle or go back and forth, and it will end up back where it started. Well, that's not strictly true, and in certain circumstances, the water's movement will end in a slightly different place than where it started. So we have kind of like this bottom loop. We have a little bit of forward movement of that moving water. We call that a mass transport or a Stokes drift. So tides are waves as well, and tides can go through some changes that cause the water, as it's sloshing in and out with the tide, to end up not quite in the place where it started. And so that can create a Stokes transport, just like a wave on the surface of the ocean might create a Stokes transport. All right, so I introduced this idea of vertically mixed estuaries. And in the type of shallow lagoons or shallow lagoonal estuaries that we have along our mid-Atlantic coast, plus lots of other places around the world, these systems are not only usually vertically mixed because they're shallow, they don't have a ton of river input often, and the tides are able to stir up the water column really well. In addition to that, the way that sand moves and migrates and the morphology of the coast changes, there are usually multiple places where the estuary exchanges with the ocean. So that would be what we call an inlet. So in this, I'm not going to be talking about Pamlico Sound, but this was just a pretty satellite photo. There are islands, so the sound would be the estuary. There are islands, and in between the islands, there are these breaks that are called inlets. And each one of those inlets is like the mouth of an estuary, but there's multiple of them that are disconnected from each other. So that starts to give us opportunity for some really interesting circulation patterns. All right, so I'm going to give you some more of my research questions later, but one of the things I'm really interested in is the exchange between oceans and estuaries. And I like to start with, why do we care? I think it's really fascinating to study physics, but if you don't care about that part of it, there's some kind of biological and chemical and water quality reasons why you might care about the amount of exchange flow. So one of the biggest ones is that the amount of water going in and out of those inlets or in and out of the mouth of an estuary is going to change the amount of time that water circulates around and flushes out of the estuary. So if you have very slow exchange, or it takes a long time to turn over the water, then you're collecting material. That material might be nutrients or pollutants. They're going to stick around in the estuary for a long time. If you have really rapid exchange, then that water will circulate and leave really quickly, and you'll have less accumulation of things that are coming off of the land. Another thing is that when the water is moving in and out of these inlets, they're carrying things like baby organisms or larvae. And so if there are certain species, like say crabs, lots of kinds of shellfish that have larval stages as part of their life cycle, those larvae get moved by the currents often out to sea and have to get back into a system. And so they would need to find a outflow and inflow to get back to an estuary habitat. And then toward the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about some issues related to sand and sand movement. And so these currents, the speed of them will determine how much material can be picked off the seafloor, sand or other kinds of sediment, and deposited, and where that material gets eroded versus deposits. And so stay tuned for a story about seabird habitat related to inlet physics. So let's look at some maps and get a little bit more introduction to the area where I'm doing my studies. So this is the state of New Jersey. And I have on here some scale bars for one of our long interconnected coastal lagoons. So this is about 60 kilometers in length, and it's pretty narrow. It's about 5-kilometer average width. And the average depth is only about 1.5 meters. So there's some places where it gets deeper, but most of it is pretty shallow. There are tiny little drainages that come in. Yeah.
So you're saying like a really tall person could literally walk across?
So yeah, you usually would hit a place where you would fall, above your head, but you could walk. Yeah, there's a lot of places where you could walk if you're pretty tall. Yeah. So we actually do some studies where we walk to deploy our instruments instead of lowering them over the side of the boat. So. All right, so like that motivation slide I had up earlier, some of the environmental concerns that might be related to flushing and circulation in the estuaries include the amount of nutrients that are loaded into the system and how long those nutrients are retained within the estuary. There's also a really vibrant shellfish aquaculture industry, and there's a lot of interest in how the aquaculture interacts with the wild species that are in those systems, and how the larvae that come from those might settle in aquaculture farms or not. So there's some interest to that. There's a lot of issues and interest in filling in of navigational channels, so sediment fills or sediments in to places where boats need to get through, and it's costly to move that sediment. And then we also have a lot of issues with it being a shallow system when we get storms like nor'easters in the winter or tropical storms that go by this time of year. The water level can really easily lift up enough to flood a lot of these low-lying surrounding issues. So each one of those things we could tie into some component of them being related to the water flow in and out of the inlets, and then the way that sets the whole patterns that happen within the estuaries. And I'll just show one previously published work that led to one of the projects I've been working on over the last few years. So I was not involved in this particular project. This is a map of that same area I was showing you along the coast of New Jersey in the previous slide. And this estuary is color-coded by the average number of days that particles that start in that area stay in that area, or stay in the bay as a whole. And so this color scale ranges from some places where it's less than a week that material would stay in that location before it would go out to the ocean on average, to other places where it will be more than a month, even as much as 50 days, that if you drop something there, it's not going to go out to the ocean for another month. And so those time ranges will lead to things like buildup of excessive nutrients, which cause excess growth, which we call eutrophication. And the places that you see as these brighter areas are well known as having problems with too many nutrients and too much biological growth. The places that have a dark blue or a kind of quick flushing time on here are, it's hard to see on this map, but they are close to inlets, which kind of makes sense. The closer you are to an inlet, the closer you are to a place where you can reach the ocean, the quicker that material will get out to sea. All right, so some of the questions that I work on my research are just a basic question of how much water goes in and out of the various inlets based on kind of their geometries. And then where does the water go? So once it makes it into the estuary, or if it hasn't left the estuary, what are the common pathways that material would be transported? And then we're really interested in how that varies over time and space, and what causes the variability. So we'll be looking at things like the shape of the inlet and how that shape of the inlet might be changing over time, because they change quite a lot. The tides and how the tides change in their strength over the different moon cycles, the wind that we get, especially during big storm events, and then rivers aren't as important for us, but they may also have a little bit of impact sometimes when we have a lot of fresh water running off of the land. So I'm not going to answer all of these for you, but I just wanted to give you that kind of big picture, and I want to give you a little bit of taste of how we go about that. All right, this slide has a ton of text, and this was just because I wanted to mention that I don't do any of this alone. Like in oceanography, we're super collaborative, so I'm always working with other scientists. And I'm going to show you a few results from two project areas that I've been working on. One with colleagues at Rutgers University and Oregon State University and a bunch of students that's been funded by the National Science Foundation. And then another one that I work on mainly with some of my colleagues at Stockton University and a few other institutions in New Jersey, also with quite a bit of student input, and that has some various sources of funding, including the US Coastal Research Program and the state of New Jersey. All right, so we've looked at a map of the whole state of New Jersey. So here's the coast that I was showing you earlier. And I've been focusing on two of our larger inlets, one called Little Egg Inlet. There's a lot of geographic locations that have the word egg in them, which has some sort of Dutch origin that I haven't quite learned yet. But so Little Egg Inlet is the one that is closest to where my institution is. We have a field station that's right about there that will allow us to get out to this inlet in about 40 minutes on a boat. So Little Egg Inlet is, here's a satellite image of it. Little Egg Inlet is really, has really interesting bathymetric patterns. It has been basically untouched over its history, meaning that there's no hard structures that have been placed there. It has been dredged out, so sediment was pulled out once in its history about 6 years ago. But other than that, it kind of just moves how it wants to move. It's within a wildlife refuge, so there's some protection for especially migratory bird species. And so that means that it's a good representation of what an inlet would do if humans didn't try to keep it in one place. The other study area that I spent a lot of time in is further north in Barnegat Inlet, and this is the opposite. This is one that has been managed or armored since about the 1920s. So there are hard rock jetties along each side of this inlet that keep its shape. Interestingly, our geology classes go there for field trips because I mentioned there's no rocks. There's rocks from Pennsylvania on those jetties, and so they go to study the rocks. So Barnegat Inlet gets regularly dredged out. So the dredges come through and bring sand out of the navigational channel and deposit it somewhere. And so it's not migrating the way it wants to migrate, or it would migrate without that modification. Right, so the way that we go in and figure out how water is flowing through there is mainly by using an instrument called an acoustic Doppler current profiler, or an ADCP. And if you haven't heard of this before, or you haven't gotten a chance to use one, the way these work is so it's an acoustic instrument that transmits sound at a certain frequency. That sound scatters off of material that's in the water, that is moving along with the water, and then the receiver detects shifts in the frequency. So this works just like a Doppler radar gun. So the way that we can tell that a car is speeding is really about the same technology that's used in this instrument. So one of the ways that we use these ADCPs is to put them into frames on the seafloor and let them sit in a mooring or sit in a stationary location over a certain amount of time and just measure the currents that are going over the top of it for that time period. So often we put them out for about a month because that's about how long the batteries last. So I have a couple pictures on here of some of our frames. I usually use these tripod ones. So we get to train students in kind of safely lifting this equipment over the side of the boat using our A-frame on our boat. You can see this one has really long chain ready to go over the side and an anchor, and then in the foreground of the picture would be a buoy. So we have the tripod sitting on the bottom, stretch out a ground chain, put another anchor, and then we have a surface buoy so we can put some instruments like CTDs near the surface and throughout the water column if we want to. So I'm going to show some examples from 2 locations in Little Egg Inlet, which is our bigger, more natural inlet. One of them I'm going to call the shoal station because it was at a shallower, kind of flat platform. And the other one I will call the channel station. And then I'll show one from the navigational channel in Barnegat Inlet. So we're going to be looking at how the flow patterns are different in these really closely geographically located stations. Right, and we're going to start with the tides. So what we're looking at here, so I have a little simplified diagram of those inlets. They're not really that close together, but so just so you can keep track of when I'm referring to those geographic locations. And in this graph, we're looking at over time. In this case, this is one day, March 15th, 2024. And each of these lines represents the average of the whole water column, so the water velocity going in or out of the inlet, so parallel to the inlet or along the main channel of the inlet. And so if that number is positive, that means that that was a flooding current or going into the estuary. And if it's negative, that means that current was ebbing or going out to the ocean. So if you compare these 3 lines, the blue is from our Barnegat Inlet, and the other 2 are from Little Egg Inlet. And with the orange one, or darker red-ish orange one right here being the one that was at a shallower location. And so we would take a look at those, and we look at things like, how frequently does it go up and down? So this is twice a day or semi-diurnal. And then we would look at what's its range, or its amplitude. And so we can see that 2 of them are pretty similar in amplitude, and the one that was in the shoal area is, especially on the ebbing phase of the tide, is not as energetic. It's slower moving currents. So we can find out some information of that. We could look at the timing. They don't all reach their fastest and slowest currents at the same time, so that's interesting too. There's a whole bunch of analysis we could do with the tides. And then if we want to look at what happens besides the tides, we can apply a filter to take out the tide wiggles from the time series and look at the more slowly changing currents, which are what we call subtidal currents. The reason that we want to do this often is if a tide is a simple tide, it will slosh material one way, slosh material the other way, and then bring it back pretty close to the same starting location. So that's not that interesting. But if we have a subtidal, slow-moving current, that's going to transport material from one place to another. So for the types of questions I have, that's a little bit more interesting than the tides. All right, so we're looking at the same 3 locations. And this time we're looking at the slowly varying currents, where, again, the positive numbers is those would be currents carrying material into the estuary. So I'm showing you a little bit longer amount of time now. So we were looking at just March 15th before, which would be right here. And so now we're looking at about 10 days, slightly more than 10 days. And so some of the things that we can notice in here is that one of our lines, the one that was over the shoal in Little Egg Inlet, is positive most of the time. And so that tells us that most of the time over that shoal, material is being moved in toward the estuary, so from the ocean in toward the estuary. But our other 2 stations, which were both in the deeper parts of the channel, most of that 10 days were carrying material out of the estuary. All right, so we can average over that. So I'm showing you averages not over just that 10 days, but over, I think it was a 6-week-long deployment in this particular case. And to look at the kind of steady flow directions that you would expect in these different parts of the inlets. So what we see in this is that our two deeper ones in Barnegat Inlet and Little Egg Inlet both had really similar, about 15 centimeter per second out of the estuary currents. And our shallower station on the shoal in Little Egg Inlet had a much smaller average. So that means it's not going to be moving material as quickly, but it's moving material into the estuary. So if you add up those numbers, one thing you might find is that they don't balance out to 0, which means that the estuary will be losing water unless it has another source of water to fill it in. So it does have a little bit of river, but it's actually, that amount of flow would drain the estuary over time. Do you have a question? Yeah. Yeah.
So you stated that it would be losing water unless it has an external source of water.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, in the case of the Little Egg Inlet and the
Barnegat Inlet, yeah.
Barnegat Inlet, what was the external source of water then?
I'll get to your question. Yeah, thanks for asking that. So the one answer, so the question was, what is the extra source of water? I'll get to it in a second. But so one thing we check for is there enough river flow coming in? There was not. So there's got to be another reason to explain that. And so that reason comes back to wind forcing. So the lower graph here is the same one we were looking at earlier of our subtidal currents. And now I've added a panel that is the wind, where I've taken the wind and I'm only showing you the part of the wind that is parallel to the inlet. So the wind might not be going exactly parallel to the inlet, but there might be some component of it that's parallel to the inlet. So that's what we're looking at. And so I'll talk about that in a second, but I'll just show you this wind rows up here. So this is a way of representing the winds as a histogram, where the longer the bar, the more often the wind was going in that direction. This is using the oceanographic convention of the direction those bars are pointing is the direction the wind is blowing toward. So if it's pointing toward the south, that would be a north or northerly wind. So in this particular deployment, which was in February of March of that year, so winter time, there was a lot of wind coming out of the northwest, going toward the southeast. And if we take the part of that, southeast going wind and see how much of it is parallel to our inlets, which this I've rotated, that's not exactly pointing north, that would be this black line up here. And hopefully you can see by using just your eye to compare the lines in the upper graph to the lines in the lower graph that the wind parallel to the inlets was really well correlated with these fluctuations that we see in the currents going parallel to the inlet. And so getting back to the question of why was there so much water leaving the estuaries, the answer seems to be that it was a particular time period that we chose where the wind forcing was favorable for bringing water out of the estuary. So there were times during this month where water did come back into the estuary, but on average, the wind was reinforcing water leaving the estuary. Then, if we kept going later in the spring, we lose that particular wind direction, and especially the winds get less strong as we get further into the spring and summer. And then we'd have more time periods that are favorable for water coming back into the estuary.
Sorry for that for elaboration. So what you said is that certain parts of the year the wind will push towards the ocean, and other parts of the year will push towards the estuary.
Yes.
And that's how it stays full, because different parts of the year will fill the rain.
Yeah, so just to repeat that, because since I'm on the microphone, so the wind has seasonal patterns to it, and there are certain times where we get wind that will have a tendency to push water out of the estuary and make the estuary water level lower on average, and other time periods where we'll see the water level sit up on average. And so when we're taking measurements, we have to measure and be aware of the other conditions like wind that were happening and try to get data over multiple years and multiple seasons to be able to figure out those types of patterns. All right, so I'm going to actually skip this one because I wanted to briefly show you another technique that we use, which is so the other part of using a mooring that is difficult is you have to decide where to put your mooring, and you can't put them everywhere all at once, even though I would like to. I only have 3 instruments and a few tripods, and I can't get permission to put an instrument everywhere that I might choose. In fact, I'm usually not allowed to put instruments in the very deepest part of the channels because those are part of federal navigational channels. So another way that we can use this acoustic Doppler current profiler instrument is to put it on the side of our vessel, or some of them will be mounted in the hull of a vessel. And then as we're driving around collecting transects, we can measure the flow underneath our boat and cover a big spatial range. So the downside of using a ship is that you can't be out there all the time, and you especially usually can't go out there when it's rough weather. So we miss a lot of those big wind events when we're using a ship. So our moorings help give us that information. The ship will help us give a bigger kind of picture, spatial picture. So we do a lot of what are called tidal cycle surveys that maybe some of you have done in some of your research work or classes, where we're trying to capture changes over a full tide cycle. We're lucky that our tides are pretty even from tide to tide, so we can go out for about 14 hours and capture a tide. Over when I did work on the West Coast, we'd have to go for 26 hours to get a tide because the tides are very variable over the day. So we're out there surveying. I have these pictures that are sunrise, sunset, and moon just to represent the time that we would spend out on the ship. So we choose places where we cross the primary currents and we measure that water flow. I'm not going to show any data from it, but we'll often also use a CTD so we can be mapping the salinity structure at the same time. So I'm going to show one example of what it looks like when we're able to get that whole section. And so this is an example from our Little Egg Inlet where we had the 2 moorings. And we are looking, so we're taking a cross-section across the inlet, and we're looking into the estuary. So we would be like the ocean, and as you're looking in through the slide, you're looking in toward the bay or toward the estuary. So I have 2 snapshots up here. So the upper panel is a color contour graph of the flow during the peak flood tide, and then the bottom one is the flow during the peak ebb tide. And if you look really carefully at the colors and where we have the really vibrant red or the darkest blue, you might notice that they aren't exactly in the same place. So the place where the flooding currents are strongest is different from the place where the ebbing currents are strongest. There's also a difference in the strength of them. So we can, because we're measuring it about every hour over the whole tide cycle, we can stitch together a picture of the average flow pattern, which would be like this graph right here. I'm missing some stuff because I was working with data I hadn't used before for this presentation, so I just threw together a quick average. So there's some other techniques we can do to fill in the gaps. But this one nicely shows that if we take these 2 plus all of the other ones over that same tide cycle and average them together, we have inflow over the shallowest part of that transect and then outflow over the deepest part of that transect. And so that is a common pattern we find in certain types of estuaries that are shallow, that the shallower part of a cross-section will have net inflow and the deeper part will have net outflow. In certain places, we see the opposite. So there's all sorts of physics related to that. The data that I was showing you earlier from the moorings, this is our shoal one. And then this is our channel one, this yellow dot, which as you see is not actually in the channel, but it's capturing that channel-influenced outflow. So so just to sum up this overview, so we've been talking about these shallow bar-built estuaries, and some of the things that we find in these systems are that tidal currents get modified a lot by the bathymetric change, so that's the figure I was just showing you. The inflow and outflow patterns are lateral or side to side instead of vertical, and a single inlet or a single time period might not show us a balanced amount of water flowing in or out. And then wind has a huge impact.
Can we find these slides in my Canvas?
I'll talk to your seminar instructor. I'd be happy to share some of them, yeah. So, yeah. So I am keeping an eye on time because I want to be able to talk about career stuff and give you a chance to answer questions. So I'm going to fly through a few things that I knew I might not have time to talk about, which are super cool, but I'm going to skip it. So, because I want to give you a little quick career tour. So this is a quick academic life history of myself. So I started out with, my undergraduate degree was a Bachelor of Arts in Biology from Carleton College, which one of your other professors also went to. And I did biology because I couldn't get into geology, and I was a little bit scared to do physics. And so I wish I'd done physics, because now I'm a physical oceanographer, but I loved biology as well. One of the things I wanted to emphasize from my undergraduate time was that I was really fortunate to be able to study abroad 3 times, and it was super transformational. So if you ever get a chance to go out to the world, definitely take it. So one that was, they were all important, but the one that I think was most important for my career trajectory is that I got to go out on a sailing vessel, the Corwith Kramer, which one of your other professors has experience with, and do a tall ship sailing semester. And on that ship is when I decided to be a physical oceanographer, so that was my pivot point. I took a little bit of a break then and did some informal education. One of the places I got to travel was to Nepal, and that part helped me realize that I do like teaching. So I like the physical oceanography and teaching. Because I hadn't had much math and physics compared to a regular physics major, I went back to school for a whole year and took extra math and physics. And then I did a master's in ocean sciences at the University of California in Santa Cruz, where I studied these really beautiful barnacle larvae. So I didn't actually get to touch the larvae, but I was doing computer models of how larval barnacles or other larval species migrate up and down the coast of California, and what does that mean for kind of interrelatedness of populations along the coast. Then I worked, I had a time period where, because of my life circumstances, I was geographically located in one place, and I was a remote research assistant through the University of Hawaii. I didn't get to live there, but I worked for them. And I was an adjunct professor teaching oceanography classes at a community college. Both of those really reinforced my kind of research and teaching combination interests. And then I went on, I decided, I wanted to go the academic route, and I went on for my PhD in oceanography at the University of Rhode Island, which a number of your professors have links to. And the work that I did there for my dissertation was looking at an estuary in Rhode Island, the Narragansett Bay, and I was studying some of the things I was talking to you about today, but in a deeper estuary. So looking at wind-driven circulation, but applying that to larval transport and hypoxia, or low oxygen conditions that happen in the summer. And then I went to Oregon State, and I spent 3 years as a postdoctoral researcher, and I did a very different project looking at fluxes of methane gas coming out of wetlands and moving out through the Columbia River estuary, which is huge, that river plume, so looking at how much methane gets processed within the estuary compared to exporting to the ocean and eventually to the atmosphere. And then 10 years ago, I joined the faculty at Stockton University in New Jersey, and I have a really nice job combining teaching and research and getting to do a lot of hands-on kind of coastal and estuarine work. And this is our boat that I'm really proud of called the RV Petrel. All right, so I made it to. Yeah, so
this one going?
I'll let you choose questions.
Yeah. So, questions?
So I know recently in the Manasquan Inlet, there was a big thing with the sand piling up a lot, about like 20 feet or so. And the general question was, do you think that would ever like fix itself, or do you think eventually the inlet would like fill itself in with sand? Because I know that
Yeah.
was getting really high and they had to dredge it out at the beginning of the year. So wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, really interesting question, and you have a lot of intricate knowledge of one of our inlets. So, yeah, so the question was about this inlet that has, it's smaller than the ones that I was talking about, but it has similar kinds of movement of a lot of sand. And it's used quite a lot, so boats need to get in and out, and so if that blocks off, that's a problem. It also would have some water quality issues. So yeah, so I actually know, because one of my I have a graduate student who works for the Army Corps, and their responsibility is kind of managing those things. There's a camera that you can watch the movement of that shoal, which I'd be happy to share. And it would, over time, move, but probably not as fast as people would like it to move. So I think they're tracking it right now, and they may dredge it out. Yeah. So.
Hi, so I have a question. I'm curious about if there's any effects of subtidal currents on the distribution of larval invertebrates.
Yeah, yes, definitely there is. So yeah, so I'll give you one like example for locally. So the area in Little Egg Inlet where that I was showing you, there's a pretty thriving wild oyster population in that particular sub-estuary, but everything to the north, the oysters are functionally extinct. So there's aquacultured oysters, but not the like wild set oysters. And so I don't have total results yet because I don't have the biological data, but the way that the flow goes would promote larvae moving from the wild population to the estuaries to the north. So we think that if the water quality conditions are improved enough that they can thrive, that they could be repopulating some of the areas in the northern estuaries. Yeah.
Sorry, and which estuary is that again?
So the estuary that has the oysters is part of this whole system I was talking about. Its specific name is the Molucca River, and then it would be moving up into Barnegat Bay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so you mentioned that the wind patterns shape the movement of the estuary. Are they estuaries or are they inlets?
So they're estuaries. The inlet is part of the estuary.
I see, yes.
Yeah.
My mistake. Anyway, but what effect does the amount of water inside and outside of the estuary have on, for example, the larvae? Like, does that affect the creatures within? Like, when the water is moved out, does that show a migration? Because I know that these larvae are, a lot of them anyway, are bound by current. So I would assume that if water is being sent out by the wind, that would mean that the larvae inside of the estuary would be sent out as well. Is that the case?
Yes, yeah, that would be. So you might imagine if, say, like a bunch of blue crabs spawned on a really windy day that promoted outflow, then more of those larvae might wash out to sea, and maybe it's harder for them to get back in, compared to if they spawned at a lucky time when it was a really quiet period in the wind, then there might be more that were retained in the estuary. So it could change those kind of pathways and the mortality rate of a certain like spawning event. So.
I was going to ask a question if there was another one. So.
Hello. So, wow. Okay. Sorry. What I wanted to ask is less direct, but I wanted to ask, what is something in the physical oceanography discipline that you wish that everybody knew?
Ooh, that is a really good question. Let's see. So I think if I wanted, like everybody, a general population, I think a concept in physical oceanography that is really important is that small changes in the water temperature and salinity, which affect its density, can cause really large changes in water movement patterns. And that has a huge impact on climate. So I think that concept is a tricky one to understand, especially when, as oceanographers or marine scientists, we might say something like, there's this warm water blob that's 1 degree warmer than normal, and it doesn't seem like that would make any difference to anybody, but it can make a big difference. So that kind of scale of small change making a huge impact in the global systems.
Cool. One more question, anyone? Yes.
What were the weather conditions like throughout this entire experiment period? And do you think the rain or anything would have affected the results?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the data that I was showing you is from one February, March, wintertime experiment. In that same project, we've done other ones in other times of year. So that one was particularly windy. One signal of that is so the moorings went out actually at the end of January, and we weren't able to get out to survey for a full day until middle of March, because every time we tried, we would get, it's usually the wind, but the weather wouldn't be suitable for getting out and doing a long survey where we're crossing the flow, so we're more prone to waves and swell. And so that was particularly windy, and there was more than average river flow. And then if I contrast that to a time when we studied in June and July, it was much drier, not much river flow at all, and much less windy. So it was more, if you look at the data, the ups and downs, that would be much more muted, just tiny little bumps instead of these big swings in the subtidal currents. Yeah.
Well, and I think we'd love to keep going, but we should probably wrap up and clear out for folks. So huge thank you to everybody. And we'll see everybody who can come at dinner at 5.